I've scored perfectly on back-to-back SAT writing tests and have a composite score of 1590 on the SAT. In this video, I'll be breaking down much of what you need to know for the digital SAT writing section. With that being said, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get started. So we have subject-verb agreement. As a basic rule, the subject and the verb of a sentence must agree in number, singular or plural. Here's an example. The dog barks loudly. The subject dog is singular and the verb barks is singular. Here's a second example. The dogs bark loudly. The subject dogs is plural and the verb bark is plural. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how do I know if a verb is singular or plural? One trick that can help you is to use what I call the he-they test. So as an example, we would say he barks. So as you can see, he is singular and barks then would be singular. If we were to say he bark, obviously that would not work because he is singular and bark is plural. Now we would say they bark. Okay, so as you can see, by using he and they, you can kind of figure out if a verb is singular or plural. With that being said, let's take a look at question number 19 to see how we can apply this. So we have, when writing The Other Black Girl 2021, novelist Zakiya Dalila Harris drew on her own experiences working at a publishing office. The award-winning book is Harris's first novel, but her writing blank honored before. Okay, in this case, we have her subject, or our subject, which is writing. Okay, so writing is our subject. Writing is singular. Okay, so since writing is singular, we need to have a singular verb that matches that. So option A, were, well, we would say they were. We would not say he were. Okay, we would say he was, and we would say they were. So were is plural, so we can get rid of A since it's plural. I'll mark that with a P. Then we have been. Well, we would say they have been, and we would say he has been. So as you can see, have been would have to also be plural, so we can mark that with a P. And then we have has been. Okay, we would say he has been. So as you can see, that would be singular. We would say they have been. Okay, so we can mark C as a singular verb. If we look at option D, we have are. We would say they are, and we would say he is. Okay, so D would be plural as well. Okay, so we can go ahead and get rid of that. We see our only answer choice here that is singular is option C, and we have to match the number of our verb to the number of our subject. Writing is singular, so our answer here has to be C. All right, let's keep moving. We've got indefinite pronouns. Okay, indefinite pronouns such as everyone, someone, and no one take singular verbs. Here's an example. Everyone has their own opinion. The indefinite pronoun here is everyone, and it's singular. The verb has is also going to have to be singular. Example number 2, no one knows the answer. The indefinite pronoun no one is singular, and the verb knows is singular. Okay, now let's talk about compound subjects. When two subjects are joined by and, they usually will take a plural verb. An example of this would be John and Sarah are going to the party. Subjects John and Sarah are plural, so the verb are must also be plural. We would not say John and Sarah is going to the party because is singular. We would have to use are, which is plural. Let's take a look at a second example. Apples and oranges are fruits. The subjects apples and oranges are plural, so the verb are must be used. And keep in mind, are is plural, is singular. Now let's talk about collective nouns. Collective nouns represent a group of individuals, can take either a singular or a plural verb depending on the context. However, most commonly, collective nouns take a singular verb. And I really want you to pay close attention to the fact that most commonly, collective nouns do take a singular verb. Now, collective nouns utilize a singular verb when the entity acts as a whole, and a plural verb when the individual members of the entity act independently. So let's look at an example of this. The team is practicing for the game. The team collectively is practicing, so the verb is singular. Now, in example 2, the team are in disagreement on the course of action. In this case, the people on the team disagree with each other, so they are acting independently, so the verb is plural. Okay, and if we scroll up, we can see that collective nouns will utilize a singular verb when the entity acts as a whole, as in example 1. The team as a whole is practicing for the game, but in example 2, it's the individual members of the entity that are acting independently in order to be in disagreement. Okay, so we would state that the team are in disagreement on the course of action. Now, once again, I want to stress that most commonly, as in example 3, you will see that collective nouns will have a singular verb. So here's another one. Congress is discussing the bill. The collective noun Congress is singular since they are collectively discussing the bill. So the verb is must also be singular. We would say Congress is discussing the bill, not Congress are discussing the bill. All right, now let's talk about intervening phrases. These are words or phrases that come between the subject and the verb, do not affect the agreement. Okay, so an example would be the cat along with its kittens sits by the window. The subject here is cat. It is not kittens. Okay, and cat is singular, so the verb sits must also be used. Okay, and sits is singular. Okay, we would say he sits. We would say they sit. Okay, so once again, you can use that he, they test as well if you're not sure if a verb is singular or plural. All right, let's take a look at example 2. The boys, as well as their friends, are playing soccer. The subject is boys, which is plural, and the verb are is also going to be used since our subject is plural. We need to also have that plural verb. All right, let's take a look at an example question here. So we've got number 26. The classic children's board game Chutes and Ladders is a version of an ancient Nepalese game, Parampeta Sopanapata. In both games, players encounter good or bad spaces while traveling along a path. Landing on one of the good spaces, then we have a verb, a player to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal. Let's identify the number of our subject. So we have landing on one of the good spaces. Well, on one of the good spaces is a prepositional phrase. Okay, we would ignore the prepositional phrase when identifying our subject. So our subject here is landing. Okay, landing is going to be singular. So I'm going to mark that with an S for singular. Now let's identify A through D, which ones are plural and which ones are singular. So we have allows. Well, we would say he allows and we would say they allow. Okay, so allows is singular since we would use it with he, but not they. If we take a look at B, we have are allowing. We would state that they are allowing and he is allowing. Okay, so are right there, we have plural. Next we have allowed. We would state they have allowed. We would state he has allowed. So once again, C would be plural as well. If we look at option D, we would state he allows and we would state that they allow. Okay, so that would be plural there. Okay, we would state landing on one of the good spaces allows a player to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal. So as you can see, only option here that's singular for our verb is option A. And once again, we need to maintain that singularity in both our subject and our verb. They need to match. Okay, so our answer would have to be A. All right, now let's talk about pronoun usage. Okay, we have pronoun antecedent agreement. A pronoun must agree in number and gender with its antecedent. An example of this would be Sarah lost her keys. The feminine pronoun her agrees with the female antecedent Sarah. Let's look at example number 2. The boys finished their homework. The plural pronoun there agrees with the plural antecedent boys. Okay, so pronoun usage there should be fairly simple. Let's take a look at a question to practice. We have question 19. Public awareness campaigns about the need to reduce single-use plastics can be successful, says researcher Kim Borg of Monash University in Australia. When these campaigns give consumers a choice, for example, Japan achieved a 40% reduction in plastic bag use after cashiers were instructed to ask customers whether blank wanted a bag. Well, let's identify our subject. Okay, our subject here would be customers. We know customers is plural. Okay, so we can scroll down here. So we've got customers, which is plural. If we look at our options, we've got 4 different pronouns. Okay, one is singular, you is singular, and it is singular. They is plural. We have to maintain, we have to match our number. Okay, so we can get rid of options B, C, and D since they would not match in number with our subject. Okay, our subject is plural. Our noun is plural. Okay, the noun that we're referring to with our pronoun, that noun is plural. Since our noun is plural, our pronoun will also need to be plural. So our answer would have to be answer choice A. All right, let's talk about ambiguous pronouns. Pronouns should have clear antecedents to avoid confusion. Here is an incorrect example. And as we go through these examples, try to pay attention to where I'm giving an incorrect example versus where I am giving a correct example, because otherwise you may end up getting confused. I will try to make it as clear as I can as I go through this. So here would be an incorrect example. Sarah and Lisa went shopping and she bought a dress. The pronoun she is ambiguous. It's not clear whether it refers to Sarah or Lisa. Okay, so make sure that it's clear who you are referring back to if you are going to use a pronoun. Now, here is a correct example. Tom saw John and congratulated him. Okay, this one is admittedly not the greatest example, but it still works, and here's why. When we say that Tom saw John, okay, Tom is still our subject. Okay, he saw John. Okay, John is the object of the verb saw. Okay, so Tom saw John and congratulated him. Okay, this is clear that Tom saw John and Tom is the one congratulating John. Okay, the pronoun him is referring to the antecedent John. Okay, let's look at another example, and this one's a bit more clear. I gave Mary the book that she wanted. Okay, the pronoun she refers to the antecedent Mary. All right, let's go ahead and move on to pronoun case. Pronouns have different forms depending on their function in the sentence: subjective, objective, and possessive. So here's an example. I went to the store. The subjective pronoun I acts as the subject of the sentence. Let's look at example 2. She gave him the gift. The objective pronoun him acts as the object of the verb gave. Now let's talk about pronoun reference. Pronouns should refer clearly and unambiguously to their intended antecedents. Here's an example. The man who won the race was happy. The pronoun who refers to the man who won the race. Here's another example. The dog that barked is mine. The pronoun that refers to the dog that barked. Now let's talk about modifier placement and comparison. Misplaced modifiers. Modifiers should be placed near the words they modify to avoid ambiguity or confusion. Now here's an incorrect example followed by the correct example. I saw a giraffe with binoculars. The modifier with binoculars should be placed near I. Okay, in this example, it should be obvious that there's a mistake because you wouldn't have a giraffe that is using binoculars. It's the individual, I, the subject, who is actually the one using the binoculars. So we need to move with binoculars in front of I. Okay, so here's how we would correct that. With binoculars, I saw a giraffe. Let's take a look at example number 2. Okay, so that once again, we'll start with the incorrect example. John caught the ball running quickly. The modifier running quickly should be placed near John. It's not the ball that is running quickly because a ball cannot run. It is John who is running quickly. Okay, so we need running quickly to refer to be placed next to John. So here's how we would correct that. We'd state running quickly as an introductory modifier. John caught the ball. Okay, running quickly is being applied to John. Now let's talk about dangling modifiers. Modifiers should clearly modify the intended subject or noun. Here's an incorrect example. After finishing the project, the snack was devoured by John. Well, the snack is not what has finished the project. Okay, a snack cannot finish a project. Okay, John is the one who finishes the project. So the modifier after finishing the project should modify whoever finished the project, which is John, not the snack. So here's how we could correct that. After finishing the project, John ate a snack. In this case, we clearly have John being what comes after this introductory modifier of after finishing the project. All right, let's go over another example. Riding the bike, the tree came into view. And once again, this is an incorrect example. The modifier riding the bike should modify whoever was riding the bike, not the tree, since a tree obviously cannot ride a bike. So here's how we could correct that. Riding the bike, John noticed the tree came into view. So as we can see, we have our modifier modifying who is actually riding the bike. All right, let's take a look at this with a question. All right, so in 1453, English King Henry VI became unfit to rule after falling gravely ill. As a result, Parliament appointed Richard, 3rd Duke of York, who had a strong claim to the English throne, to rule as Lord Protector. Upon recovering 2 years later, okay, so here we have an introductory modifier. Upon recovering 2 years later, well, we know the person who fell ill is King Henry. Okay, so we need to have King Henry after this. So if we look at our options, we have Henry as what's being modified, the reign of Henry. It can't be the reign of Henry because Henry is the one who fell ill. So Henry is the one who will recover 2 years later. We have Henry's reign. Okay, it's not his reign that is being modified. And it was Henry who resumed his reign. Okay, it's not it. We need to modify Henry. Okay, Henry needs to be what is immediately after that comma. Okay, so our answer there would have to be A. Now this is a pretty common type of question on the digital SAT, so make sure you understand how to work with these introductory modifiers. All right, let's talk about comparative and superlative adjectives. Adjectives should be used correctly when comparing two or more items. So here's an example. This book is taller than that one. We're comparing the height of two books. Now, really, what I'm trying to teach right here is pretty simple, right? If we're comparing two things, we would state that one is taller than the other. Now let's take a look at example 2. If we're stating that we're comparing, one to many, doing a one-to-many comparison is not a one-to-one comparison. So in this case, in example 2, we have, she is the smartest student in the class. We're comparing the intelligence of students in the class. So this is a one-to-many comparison. We're comparing the one, which is she, to all of the students in the class. So we would state she is the smartest student in the class. All right, parallel comparisons. Comparisons should be parallel in structure. Here's an example. She likes to run, swim, and hike. Okay, so this one isn't really a comparison. This one's just a list of activities. So we want to maintain parallelism. We would not say she likes to run, swimming, and hiked, right? We would want to maintain parallelism for this. So she likes to run, swim, and hike. Example 2, the company is efficient, reliable, and customer-oriented. This is a parallel list of qualities of the company. Now let's talk about double comparisons. Avoid using two comparative forms in the same sentence. So this kind of goes back to the school example. So an incorrect example would be, she is more talented than any other student in the school, okay? Now, a much better way to say this would be, she is the most talented student in the school. As you can see, it cuts down on the wordiness. And also, since we're doing a one-to-many comparison, okay, we would want to state that she is the most talented student in the school, not that she is more talented than any other student in the school, okay, because that just adds on wordiness. We want to be as concise as we can. So our answer there would have to be, she is the most talented student in the school. All right, now let's talk about parallelism. Parallel structure in list. Items in a list should be presented in parallel form. We've kind of talked about this already, but I want to go a little bit further with it. So we have, as an example, he likes to read, write, and listen to music. Okay, so parallel list of activities, read, write, and listen. The chef prepared a delicious appetizer, main course, and dessert. This is a parallel list of dishes. Now let's talk about parallel structure in comparison. So this is where we get into that comparisons that we didn't really touch on as much earlier. When making comparisons, the elements being compared should have parallel structures. Here's an example. The company is as successful as it is innovative. We're comparing success and innovation, which are two qualities that can describe the company. All right. Example 2. She is not only a talented singer, but also a skilled dancer. Okay, we're comparing talent in singing and dancing. Now, you want to pay attention to that structure. You want to maintain parallel structure. So let's talk about parallel structure in clauses. Clauses should maintain parallel structure to enhance clarity and coherence. Example, once again, we have parallel list of activities. She likes to swim, to run, and to play tennis. So now we have to swim, to run, and to play. Okay, now I know I'm stressing parallelism a lot. That's because it's pretty important on the digital SAT writing section. I will say that compared to the paper SAT, it seems like parallelism has been showing up a little bit less often on the digital SAT practice test than it did on the paper SAT. But that's just something that I've noticed. Anyways, let's talk about example number 2. He wants to travel, to explore, and to experience new cultures. We have a parallel list of desires. All right, now let's talk about verb tenses. Proper use of verb tenses. Verb tenses indicate the time at which an action takes place. It is important to use the appropriate verb tense to convey the correct time frame. All right, so let's talk about the future simple tense. I will go to the party tomorrow. This is future simple tense. It indicates a future action. Let's talk about example number 2. They have already finished their homework. This is present perfect tense. It indicates an action completed in the past with a present result. Now let's talk about sequencing events. Verb tenses help to indicate the chronological order of events. Choose the appropriate verb tense to accurately represent the sequence of actions. Here's an example. She finished her meal and then paid the bill. This is past simple tense. It indicates actions completed in the past. Another example. He had left before I arrived. This is past perfect tense. It indicates an action completed before another past action. Okay, so the first past action that's completed is he had left. Okay, and then the next past action would be before I arrived. Okay, so I arrived. Now let's talk about consistency in verb tenses. Maintaining consistency in verb tenses throughout a sentence or paragraph helps to ensure clarity and coherence. And this is something that is commonly tested on the SAT writing section, so you do really want to pay attention to this part right here. So let's talk about an example. She walks to work every day and always arrives on time. This is present simple tense. It indicates a habitual action. The way you might see this tested on the digital SAT writing section would be that arrives would be an answer option, and it would be left blank on the digital SAT writing section. So you would have, she walks to work every day and always blank on time. And you would have to recognize that you have walks as your verb tense in the sentence, and you have to match the verb tense then of your answer choice, which would be arrives here. So that's one of the ways that you could see this tested. Let's give another example. The team played well, but they lost the game. This is past simple tense and it indicates a past event. So once again, the way you would likely see this tested is lost or played might be left out as a blank, and then you'd have to recognize your verb that is left. So in this case, let's say that lost was left out as a blank. You would recognize that you have played, which is the past simple tense, and then you would need to select your answer choice that represents the past simple tense as well. All right, let's talk about more complex verb tenses. So we have future perfect. The future perfect tense is used to express an action that will be completed before a specific point in the future. An example would be, by this time next year, I will have graduated from college. Future perfect tense is indicating an action completed in the future before another future event. All right, let's talk about the conditional tense. The conditional tense is used to express actions that are dependent on a condition or hypothetical situations. An example is, if it rained, we would have stayed indoors. So once again, this is conditional tense expresses a hypothetical situation. Okay, in this case, the hypothetical situation is if it rained. Past perfect tense. The past perfect tense is used to express an action completed before another past action or a specific point in the past. An example is, she had already finished the book before the movie was released. Once again, this is past perfect tense, indicates an action completed before another past event. Let's talk about the conditional perfect. Okay, conditional perfect tense is used to express hypothetical actions that would have been completed under certain conditions. An example is, if they had studied harder, so that is the hypothetical action, they would have passed the exam. So conditional perfect tense expresses a hypothetical situation in the past. So the condition here is if they had studied harder, then what would have happened is they would have passed the exam. So once again, the condition is if they had studied harder, what would have happened is they would have passed the exam. So there's the conditional perfect. Now we have the present perfect continuous. The present perfect continuous tense is used to express ongoing actions that started in the past and continue into the present. An example is, they have been playing tennis all morning. So once again, this is present perfect continuous tense. It indicates an ongoing action starting in the past and continuing into the present. Okay, so they began, okay, this action started in the past. They began playing tennis in the past, and it's continuing into the present. They have been playing tennis all morning. Past perfect continuous. The past perfect continuous tense is used to express ongoing actions that started and continued in the past before another past event. An example is, he had been working at the company for 5 years before he was promoted. Okay, so once again, we are expressing ongoing actions that started and continued in the past before another past event. Okay, so he had started working at the company before this past event. Okay, so he started and continued working at the company for 5 years before he was promoted, which is the past event. All right, by understanding the nuances of different verb tenses, you can accurately convey the time frame, sequence, and continuity of events in your writing. All right, let's talk about sentence structure. So let's start with run-on sentences. And run-on sentences are very commonly tested on the digital SAT writing section, so you do need to pay close attention here. You want to avoid run-on sentences by properly separating independent clauses, and we'll talk about how to do that later on. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple examples first. So we have, I walked to the store, comma, and I bought some groceries. I walked to the store is an independent clause. I bought some groceries is another independent clause. We can connect two independent clauses with a comma and one of the fanboys, which are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. All right, let's talk about, next example. She studied hard for the test, but she still failed. Okay, so she studied hard for the test. It's an independent clause. And then we have a comma and one of the fanboys, in this case, but, and then we have she still failed, which is also an independent clause. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to comma splices. Okay, do not use a comma to join two independent clauses without a coordinating conjunction or appropriate punctuation. Here's an incorrect example. I studied all night. I passed the exam. Here we have a comma splice because we are trying to connect two independent clauses with only a comma and without one of the fanboys. Okay, so that's an incorrect. Here's how we can correct that. We would state, I studied all night, comma, and I passed the exam. Now, a second incorrect example would be, he ran fast. He lost the race. He ran fast as an independent clause. He lost the race as an independent clause. Here's how we could correct this. He ran fast, comma, but he lost the race. So let me quickly touch on how you can kind of know when to use which coordinating conjunctions. And if you hear coordinating conjunctions, just think the fanboys. Okay, the fanboys are the most common examples of coordinating conjunctions. Okay, so how would we know to use but here instead of something like so or yet? Well, he ran fast. If he ran fast, we would expect him to win the race, but he lost the race. So this is a contrast to what would be expected. So we could use but in this case. Let's take a look at fragments. So you want to ensure that sentences have a subject and a verb and are not incomplete. Once again, you want your sentences to be complete. So let's look at an incorrect example. After finishing the race. Okay, this would be a sentence fragment. It is not a complete idea. It is not a complete sentence. If we look at the correct version of that, it would be, after finishing the race, I felt tired. I felt tired is an independent clause. Okay, after finishing the race is referring to I. Okay, so that's a complete sentence. Let's look at incorrect example number 2. Running towards the finish line. Okay, we don't know who is running towards the finish line. This isn't a complete thought. If we look at how we would correct that, we would have running towards the finish line, I felt exhilarated. Okay, in this case, we are referring to I. We are modifying I. All right, looking at D, dependent clauses. Dependent clauses can't stand alone as complete sentences and must be attached to an independent clause. Okay, and let me zoom in. Okay, so dependent clauses can't stand alone as complete sentences, must be attached to an independent clause. An example of this, although it was raining, they went for a walk. Okay, although it was raining is a dependent clause. Okay, it cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. All right, example number 2. When the bell rings, class ends. When the bell rings is the dependent clause there. Okay, it cannot stand on its own as a sentence. Now let's talk about independent clauses. Independent clauses can stand alone as complete sentences. An example would be, I went to the store. That is a complete thought, it's a complete idea, it has a subject and a finite verb. If we look at example number 2, the sun was shining brightly. Okay, that is also a complete sentence. Now let's talk about sentence logic and clarity. Eliminating redundancy. This is something that was very, very commonly tested on the paper writing section. Now that the SAT has moved digital, I haven't been seeing it tested quite as much, but it is still something that's important to know. Okay, you have eliminating redundancy, remove unnecessary repetition in sentences to improve clarity and conciseness. So here is an incorrect example, and there's a few of these that I'll go over. So starting with, I saw him with my own eyes. With my own eyes is redundant. If I say I saw him, the only way I can do that is with my own eyes. So we'd correct that by just stating, I saw him. Okay, now here's 2 other examples that I think are a little bit more similar to what you could see on the digital SAT writing section. So one option would be, I ran home to Megan. Megan is my sister. Eliminate the redundancy of saying Megan back to back. Okay, so here's how we could do that. We would state, I ran home to Megan, comma, my sister. Okay, my sister is describing who Megan is. And by doing this, we're able to repeat stating Megan back to back. So we can get rid of that. And we can also eliminate having to use is by just using that comma. Here's another incorrect example. The teacher explained the concept briefly in a short manner. Okay, briefly and in a short manner mean the same thing. So we would only want to use one of those. And the most concise way to do that would be to get rid of in a short manner and just say briefly. So as you can see in the correct example, we could state the teacher explained the concept briefly. All right, let's talk about clarity of pronoun reference. You want to ensure that pronouns have clear and unambiguous antecedents. So we've kind of already touched on this. Let's just go over it again. Okay, an incorrect example would be after Sarah told Rachel the bad news, she was very upset. It's unclear if she refers to Sarah or Rachel. The corrected example would be after Sarah told Rachel the bad news, Rachel was very upset. Okay, here's 2 more correct examples. John gave the book to Mary and she read it. The pronoun it refers to the book. The pronoun she will refer back to Mary. All right, another example would be the dog followed its owner, wagging its tail happily. Well, obviously the dog would be what's referring to by its. Logical comparison. You want to make logical and meaning comparisons in sentences. And what this is really talking about is you want to make sure you're comparing like to like. So as an example, apples are healthier than donuts. We're comparing food to food. An example 2, the flight was longer than the duration of the sunset. Okay, in this case, it's presumed that we're talking about the flight's duration. We're comparing that to the duration of the sunset. Okay, if we look at option C or example C, Sweden's obesity rate is less than that of the United States. And example 3 is one that I think is really important to highlight. Okay, when we say Sweden's obesity rate is less than that of the United States, the key part I want you to pay attention to here is that we included that of. If we were to say Sweden's obesity rate is less than the United States, that's not as good as if we state Sweden's obesity rate is less than that of the United States, because by adding that of, okay, we know that we're referring to the obesity rate of the United States, which is more clear than if we just say Sweden's obesity rate is less than the United States. All right, let's talk about appropriate word choice. You want to use words that accurately convey the intended meaning in a sentence. An example is, the book he purchased was truly captivating. The word captivating accurately describes the engaging nature of the book. Now, on the digital SAT, you'll more commonly see word choice questions like this show up actually towards the On the digital SAT practice test, it's been towards the beginning of the sections. And it's also, in my opinion, categorized more so in actually the reading section because it's more so about the word in context. But I did still want to touch on it here because you do still need to understand words in context in order to be able to answer questions on the writing section. Now, some of you guys may be wondering at this point, what's the difference sort of between reading and writing on the digital SAT since they're all sort of combined into the same section. And it's really just about the classification of the different questions. So some questions can be classified more as reading questions, even though it's within the reading and writing section, which is now combined section. And some questions can be more confined to testing your writing abilities. So when I'm talking about writing questions, I'm talking about questions that are specifically designed to test your writing ability. When I talk about reading questions, I'm talking about reading questions that are specifically designed to test your reading comprehension, your understanding of words in context, and things like that. So even though they are combined into the same sections, there are still questions that are more so testing writing and some that are more so testing reading. But anyways, here's example number 2. It was an incredibly grueling marathon. The word grueling conveys the extreme difficulty and exhaustion associated with the marathon. Next, we have idioms and diction, prepositions. So let's talk about the appropriate use of idioms. You want to use idiomatic expressions correctly to convey the intended meaning. An example would be, she passed away. It's an idiomatic expression for she died. They got along well. That's an idiomatic expression for they had a good relationship. I'll talk about correct preposition choice, and this is what you might see more commonly on the digital SAT writing section. So using the correct preposition in phrases and expressions. An example would be, she is afraid of spiders. Okay. The preposition here would be afraid of. So you could have options that are afraid in, afraid with, but obviously you would state that she is afraid of spiders. So when we're talking about preposition choice, this is the way that it could show up. So example 2 is, I am interested in playing the piano. Okay. So in this case, we are looking at in, okay, interested in playing the piano. Okay. So the preposition there would be in. And now let's talk about proper use of prepositional phrases. So something that is just generally very useful to recognize on the digital SAT writing section is prepositional phrases. I've already kind of talked about how you need to get rid of them when you're determining your subject, which is helpful for matching the number of your subject to the number of your verb. Using prepositional phrases accurately to provide additional information about the subject or object of a sentence. An example of this would be, the cat is sitting on the chair. So on the chair is the prepositional phrase. She walked through the forest. Through the forest would be the prepositional phrase there. Now we can talk about punctuation. Apostrophes. You want to use apostrophes to indicate possession or contraction. An example would be, John's car is old. We have an apostrophe for possession since the car belongs to John. Next, we have it's raining outside. This is an apostrophe used for contraction because it's, in this case, is it is. We would say it is raining outside. Example 3, the children's toys were scattered all over the room. This is an apostrophe being used for plural possession. Children is already plural, so we would add on the apostrophe s to indicate that it's possessive of the toys. Example 4, these are the cat's bowls. Okay, cats with an s is the plural version of cat. Then we need to add an apostrophe onto the end of that to indicate that it is the cat's bowls. Okay, there is a possessive relationship there. If we look at example number 5, we're going to the park. This is an apostrophe for contraction. The contraction would be we are to were. If we look at example 6, they're my best friends. This is an apostrophe for contraction. They're being the contraction of they are. Now let's talk about semicolons and periods. This is something that's obviously very important to understand. So we have use semicolons to separate independent clauses or to separate items in a series that already contain commas. Okay, and you are going to see kind of both of these uses on the digital SAT writing section. You want to use periods at the end of a complete sentence. So an example would be, I went to the store with a semicolon. I bought some milk and bread. Okay, so we have 2 independent clauses that we're connecting with a semicolon. So semicolon separates independent clauses. Example number 2, my best friends are John, who is a lawyer, Mary, who is a nurse, and Tom, who is a teacher. In this case, we have a semicolon separating items in a series that already contain commas. So as you can see, we state name, comma, and then occupation, who is a lawyer, Mary, comma, who is a nurse, Tom, comma, who is a teacher. So in this case, within the list itself, we have commas. So we would actually use semicolons to separate each item in that list. Example 3, I haven't been feeling well. I think I might have the flu. So we would use a semicolon to separate these 2 independent clauses. If you look at example 4, the museum exhibit includes paintings from Van Gogh, the Dutch artist, Monet, the French impressionist, and Klimt, the Australian symbolist. Okay, in this case, semicolon separates items in a series that already contain commas. Okay, so if we scroll up, example 4 is similar to example 2. Example number 5, she couldn't make it to the party. She was caught up with work. So in this case, we're splitting up 2 independent clauses with a period. If we look at example 6, the weather was perfect for a walk. It was mildly sunny with a cool breeze. We're using a period to separate 2 independent clauses there as well. All right, let's give an example here with question number 23. John Hinson, director of Language Revitalization Program of the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, helped produce the world's first indigenous language instructional app, Chickasaw Blank. And then we have Chickasaw TV in 2010 and a Rosetta Stone language course in 2015. So what you'll see here is we have this list and we are using a comma before we state the date. Okay, so we have comma before we state the date. So if we scroll down to our answer choices, we need to look for one that has a comma before we state the date. So we can get rid of A and B since they use semicolons here and here. Then if we look at the differences between C and D, we see that the differences are right here, whether or not we use a semicolon or a comma after the year. Now, if we scroll up, we see that after the year, we are using a semicolon. Okay, we're using a semicolon to split up this list of items where a comma is used with each item. Okay, so after 2009, we need to have that semicolon. Okay, so our answer there would have to be C. All right, let's talk about commas. You want to use commas to separate items in a series after introductory phrases, to set off non-essential clauses or phrases, and to separate coordinate adjectives. An example is I bought apples, oranges, and bananas at the store. A comma separates the items in a series. Example 2, however, comma, they still managed to win the game. A comma after an introductory phrase is what we're using there. All right, colons. You want to use colons to introduce a list to separate clauses when the second clause explains or amplifies the first, or to introduce a quote or example. So here's an example. The ingredients for the recipe are flour, sugar, eggs, and milk. In this case, we have a colon introducing a list. Example 2, he had one thought in mind, to succeed. In this case, we have a colon separating clauses. Example number 3, we have her dream was simple yet profound, to travel the world and discover herself in the process. In this case, the colon introduces a clause that elaborates and explains the dream mentioned in the preceding clause. And example 3 and example 1 are really the two best examples of what you could see for the use of a colon on the digital SAT writing section. In particular, example 3, okay? But both of them are really the way that you would kind of see this show up on the digital SAT writing section. So example 3 is one that I want to talk a little bit more about. So let's just go ahead and discuss it. Her dream was simple yet profound, to travel the world and discover herself in the process. If your second clause is illustrating, explaining, or describing what came before it, that's a very common case where you're going to want to use a colon. Okay, so I want to really focus in on that when your second clause explains or amplifies the first, that's a situation where you're going to want to use a colon. All right, let's talk about dashes. So you'll use dashes to set off parenthetical elements or to emphasize certain words or phrases. Example would be the car, dash, a bright red sports car, dash, caught everyone's attention. Okay, in this case, a bright red sports car is non-essential. You could state the car caught everyone's attention and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. If we look at example 2, she was determined against all odds to finish the race. Okay, in this case, we are emphasizing against all odds. All right, if we take a look at adjectives and adverbs, we want to know proper use of adjectives. So you'll use adjectives to describe or modify nouns. An example would be she wore a beautiful dress to the party. In this case, the adjective beautiful is describing the noun dress. Another example would be the tall building can be seen from miles away. The adjective tall is describing the noun building. Let's talk about proper use of adverbs. So you'll use adverbs to modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. An example would be he ran quickly to catch the bus. The adverb quickly is modifying the verb ran. Another example would be she spoke softly to avoid waking the baby. The adverb softly is modifying the verb spoke. Let's talk about word pairs. So we need to know commonly confused words. So use appropriate words and avoid common mistakes in word usage. So let's talk about a few examples, and then I have a list that I'll kind of run through of some commonly confused words. So we have example 1, their dog is friendly. This is the correct possessive pronoun. Okay, so it's THEIR when you want a possessive pronoun. Now in contrast, if we look at example number 2, we have they apostrophe RE going to the party. Okay, they're going to the party. This is a contraction of they are. So you need to understand the difference between T-H-E-I-R and T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E. This is a contraction for they are. Let's look at example one again. We have accept the invitation, to agree to something. Okay, so the version of accept with an A at the start. If we look at example 2, we have except for him, except with an E here, everyone attended the meeting. Now accept, E-X-C-E-P-T, is excluding someone. Let's look at our next example. Your advice is helpful. Well, in this case, we have the noun advice. If you look at example number 2, I advise, with an S, not a C, you to listen to his instruction. Okay, this is a verb. All right, so now we have a list of word pairs that you should know, which I'll quickly go over. We have accept versus accept, which I discussed above. Affect, which is to influence, versus effect, which is a result. Complement, which is something that completes, versus compliment, which is praise. For example, I give a compliment to someone when I say I like their shoes. Next, we have elicit, which is to draw out, versus illicit, which is forbidden by law. Its, which is a possessive form of it, versus it apostrophe s, its, which is a contraction of it is. We have principle, which is main, versus the principle, or versus principle, which is a fundamental belief or rule. So example would be life principles, right? Fundamental beliefs about life. Stationary, not moving. Stationary, writing materials. Than, used in comparisons. Then, at a time, or at that time. There, T-H-E-I-R, possessive form of they. There, T-H-E-R-E, is in that place. And there, T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E, which is a contraction of they are. To is a preposition. To, which is also or excessively, and then to, which is the number. Your, which is a possessive form of you, and your with an apostrophe R-E, which is a contraction of you are. Let's talk about who, which, and whom. We have the proper use of who versus whom. You use who to refer to the subject of a sentence and whom to refer to the object of a verb or preposition. So an example is, who is the man who fixed my car? Well, the subject of the verb fixed. Example 2, to whom should I address the letter? The object of the preposition to. All right, so let's talk about the he, him trick. This is really what I want to use to highlight the who versus whom because it makes things a bit simpler. It can help you determine whether to use who or whom in a sentence. So let's use example number 1. Okay, so if the answer to this question could be he, then we'll use who. If the answer to the question could be him, then we'll use whom. Okay, so who is the man who fixed my car? Well, we could state he is the man who fixed my car. Okay, so we would state who instead of whom. Okay, so ask the question, who fixed my car? The answer is he fixed my car, so we would use who. Example number 2, to whom should I address the letter? Well, we can ask the question, should I address the letter to him? We wouldn't state, should I address the letter to he? We would say, should I address the letter to him? So because of that, we would want to use whom there. Okay, so that is the he, him test that you can use. Okay, so once again, that's the he, him test. All right, using the he, him trick makes it easier to decide whether to use who or whom based on the role the word plays in the sentence. Proper use of which. You use which to introduce non-restrictive clauses and that to introduce restrictive clauses. So when you think non-restrictive versus restrictive, another way to think about that is essential versus non-essential. So if we take a look at example 1, the car, which is red, belongs to John. If we were to remove which is red, we would have the car belongs to John. That doesn't substantially change the meaning of the sentence. Okay, so that's fine. If you look at option 2 or example 2, the car that is red belongs to John. Well, this is restrictive because we are restricting the car to the one that is red. Okay, we're not just stating the car belongs to John, we're stating the car that is red. So presumably this is in a series of multiple cars of different colors and we are stating it is the one that is red. So this is restrictive to just the car that is red. Okay, so that's the difference between non-restrictive and restrictive. All right, let's talk about distinguishing between these two. Understand the difference between clauses that are necessary for understanding the sentence and those that provide additional information. Example 1, the book that she borrowed is on the shelf. Okay, that she borrowed is restrictive. It's restricting which book it is. It is the book that she borrowed. If you look at example 2, her car, which is blue, is parked outside. This is non-restrictive. We are just adding in more information, but we're not restricting which car it is. If we were to state her car that is blue is parked outside, then we would be restricting car, but we're not in this case. We're just providing additional information, so it's non-essential. All right, let's talk about transitions. Using transition words and phrases effectively. Use transitional words and phrases to create coherence and a smooth flow between ideas in paragraphs. Example 1. First, we went to the store, then we went to the park. Okay, so first would be a transition here, and then we have then. So we're indicating a sequential progression. Example 2. However, some people disagree with this viewpoint. In this case, we are providing a contrast with however. We want to coherently connect ideas and paragraphs. Ensure that ideas and paragraphs are logically connected to maintain coherence in writing. Example number 1. The first reason for this decision is financial. Okay, so we're stating the first reason, and then we have additionally, it aligns with our long-term goals. So we are providing a second reason, therefore we would use additionally because we're adding on. If we look at example 2, in conclusion, there are several factors to consider when making this decision. So in conclusion would be our transition there. We want to maintain a smooth flow and logical progression in writing. Okay, and I'll go over a bunch of transitions I want you to know in a bit here, but for now, let's keep talking. Organize ideas and sentences to ensure a logical progression, smooth flow of information. So to begin with, we analyzed the data. Next, we identified the trends. Finally, we drew conclusions. So in this case, since we would start with to begin with, and we have next, an example question that you could see is you would have to answer what transition should be here. You would notice that we are going in a sequence. So you'd want to use finally if we are at the last part of that sequence. Okay, we drew conclusions. Example 2, moreover, it is important to consider the potential consequences before taking action. So in that case, that'd be something that we are adding on to. All right, so here's some common SAT writing transitions along with example sentences. So first off, let's start by talking about introductory. So examples would be to begin with, first and foremost, in the first place, initially. So an example would be initially, we conducted a thorough analysis of the data. Next, let's talk about addition and continuation. This is very common. Additionally, furthermore, moreover, in addition to, also, moreover. So an example would be furthermore, the results of the study support our hypothesis. Let's talk about contrast, another very common one. We have however, on the other hand, conversely, nevertheless, nonetheless, yet, instead, and in contrast. Okay, and contrast is a very common one. Same with however. So in this case, for our example, we have, however, some people may hold a different viewpoint on this issue. So a different viewpoint than what was discussed previously. So that would indicate to us that we would be looking for a contrast there. Next, let's talk about cause and effect. So we would state in our previous sentence that we had some sort of cause, and then in the sentence that we're transitioning to, we have our effect. So as a result, stating as a result of what came before. Consequently, as a consequence of what came before. Therefore, thus, for this reason, hence. So consequently, so as a consequence of what came before, thus what came after. Consequently, the company experienced significant growth. So before this, we would probably expect to have something like the company changed its leadership to focus on growth or something like that. And then as a result of them changing the leadership, the company experienced significant growth. All right, sequence and time. This one's also fairly common. So you would use this if you are going in sort of a progression. So we have next, then, subsequently, or in other words, what came after, or, the next thing. Afterward, meanwhile, simultaneously. Simultaneously would be at the same time. Finally, eventually, ultimately. An example would be afterward, we proceeded to analyze the gathered data. All right, now let's talk about how you would transition if you are giving an example. So you would use for instance to illustrate specifically a case in point as an example to demonstrate. An example of this would be for instance. So you will often see for instance or for example. Those are probably the two most common versions of this. So for instance, many successful companies started as small startups. Okay, so before this, we could have some sort of claim that successful companies don't just arise from spin-offs of large corporations. And then we say, for instance, many successful companies started as small startups. Obviously, small startups is different from a spin-off from a major corporation. Okay, so we'd be providing an example to that claim. All right, question number 7, comparing and contrasting. So we've already kind of talked about contrasting. Okay, in this case, we'll talk about comparing. There are some in here that are kind of repeats from contrasting, but this is kind of two very similar things, so I did categorize them together. So we have similarly, okay, so if something's similar to what came before it, likewise, pretty much the same as similar if something is like what came before it. In the same way, very similar to the first two. On the contrary, so this would be contrast, however, which is a contrast, conversely, which is a contrast, in contrast, which is obviously a contrast, and then on the other hand, which is also a contrast. Okay, in this case, likewise, we are doing something that's similar. Okay, so likewise, the second study also found users preferred option A to option B. So presumably the sentence that came before it would be something stating that we had study A, or the first study found users preferred option A to option B. Okay, and then we're stating likewise, the second study also found users preferred option A to option B. All right, summary and conclusion. So in conclusion, to sum up, overall. In summary, okay, so an example would be, in conclusion, the findings strongly support our hypothesis. So you would use these if you are coming to a conclusion or you are stating a summary of what came before. All right, emphasis. Okay, some examples of emphasis would be indeed. Okay, indeed is probably the most common example of emphasis. You have notably, specifically, in fact, and particularly. An example would be, indeed, the data supports the hypothesis that was initially proposed. Finally, we have a comparison of options. Some examples would be whereas. Okay, so we would state something that came before it, and then we have another option. We would state whereas option, for an example would be, we would state option 1 is a mediocre option, whereas option 2 is a superior option. Next, we have in contrast to. So once again, that can also be used as a comparison of two different things. On the other hand, once again, that can also be used as a comparison and as a contrast. Alternatively, okay, you'd provide some sort of alternative to something that came before it. And then conversely, which once again can be used as a contrast as well. Okay, an example would be, alternatively, we can consider a different approach to solve this problem. Remember, transitions are not just words or phrases to be inserted randomly in your writing. Okay, they need to actually serve a purpose. Okay, they serve as signposts to guide your reader through your ideas, helping to create a logical and coherent flow. All right, lastly, let's talk about subjunctives. Subjunctives are used to express hypothetical or unreal situations, wishes, recommendations, and emotions. Here's a more detailed explanation of when and how to use subjunctives. All right, number 1, use of were in hypothetical statements. In hypothetical or contrary to fact situations, use were instead of was after the pronouns I, he, she, and it. Okay, example 1, if I were a bird, I would fly freely in the sky. We wouldn't state if I was a bird, we would state if I were a bird, I would fly freely in the sky. Okay, keep in mind this is a hypothetical. Obviously, I am not a bird. If you look at example 2, she speaks as if she were the queen. Okay, once again, this is a hypothetical, as if. Okay, she's not actually the queen. So we'd state she speaks as if she were the queen. Okay, keep in mind that this is different from what you'd expect when you're just straight up matching the number of your verb to the number of your subject, because obviously if we were just doing that, we would state she was, but we have to take account for the fact that this is a subjunctive. We are in a hypothetical, okay, as if she were the queen. She's not actually the queen. This is a hypothetical, so we have to keep in mind that we need to use were instead of was after the pronouns I, he, she, and it. All right, number 2, use of the base form of the verb after certain verbs. After certain verbs of recommendation, request, suggestion, or necessity, use the base form of the verb infinitive without to express the subjunctive mood. An example would be, it is important that he arrive on time. Once again, this is a difference from when you are just strictly matching the number of your subject to the number of your verb. If we would state he arrives and we would state they arrive, but because we are in the subjunctive, we would state it is important that he arrive on time. Okay, so once again, you need to pay close attention to if you're in the subjunctive or if you are not. Example number 2, the teacher insisted that we study for the exam. Okay, now let's talk about the use of past subjunctive form for wishes or desires. So when expressing wishes or desires about unreal or unlikely situations in the past or in the present or past, use the subjunctive form of the verb. I wish I were taller. It would be an example of that. Example 2, she wishes she had studied harder for the test. All right, number 4, use of were to for unlikely or hypothetical future events. To indicate unlikely or hypothetical future events, use the phrase were to followed by the base form of the verb. Now, if you are someone who grew up in the U.S. And who spoke English throughout their childhood, this should come pretty naturally. Okay, an example would be, if it were to rain tomorrow, we would have to cancel the picnic. Okay, so once again, we are in that hypothetical. Okay, and in this case, we're in the hypothetical future event. Okay, if it were to rain tomorrow, future, we would have to cancel the picnic. Suppose I were to win the lottery, what would you do? Once again, this would be a hypothetical future event. Okay, suppose I were to win the lottery. That's future and hypothetical. So we'd say I were to. Okay, it's important to use subjunctives carefully and appropriately in formal writing. Subjunctives are often used in more formal or literary texts and can add depth and nuance to your writing. By understanding when and how to use subjunctives, you can effectively convey hypothetical situations, wishes, recommendations, and emotions in your writing. All right, this SAT writing guide covers the various aspects of grammar, sentence structure, word usage, punctuation, and coherence in writing. It's important to study and understand these rules in order to improve writing skills and achieve a higher score on the SAT writing section. And I will add on to that it's important to practice and get practice and reps under your belt, seeing these questions and applying what was covered here. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and consider sending a super thanks to help support my channel. Additionally, please drop a comment below letting me know what videos you want me to make in the future. And if you are looking for additional educational services that I offer, please check out my website, haydenrhodea.com.